They say the truth doesn't need a voice, it only needs a face. And that morning it walked onto a school stage under bright white lights while a room full of parents adjusted in their seats. The low hum of chatter fading as the principal welcomed a very special guest, Ethan Caldwell, the man whose name was printed on buildings and headlines, the man who had built an empire so precise it left no room for mistakes. And yet as he stepped into the auditorium, tailored suit sharp, expression composed, something shifted in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm breaks. Because at the far end of the stage a young boy stood waiting his turn, small frame, steady posture, fingers wrapped around a presentation card. And when Ethan's eyes found him, the world narrowed in a way it never had before. The boy's face wasn't just familiar, it was exact, the same sharp line of the jaw, the same quiet intensity in the eyes, the same way his lips pressed together as if holding something back. And for a second Ethan didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't move, the applause around him turning into a dull echo as his mind tried to reject what his eyes refused to ignore. And then the lights dimmed slightly as the science fair presentations began, students stepping up one by one, voices nervous but proud, parents smiling, phones lifting, capturing every second, until it was the boy's turn, Noah Brooks. The name displayed in clean white letters on the screen behind him, and he stepped forward without hesitation, voice clear, steady, talking about family traits, about how DNA carries history, how it tells stories people don't always say out loud. And somewhere in the second row, a woman stood near the aisle, silent, composed, her presence quiet but unshakable. Amara Brooks, her eyes not on the audience, not on the teachers, but fixed on the boy, protective, grounded. And when Ethan saw her, recognition hit differently, not sharp but heavy, like something buried rising slowly to the surface. Memories he had locked away behind boardrooms and contracts, behind decisions he never allowed himself to revisit. And the room seemed smaller now, tighter, as if the walls were leaning in to witness what was about to unfold. Noah clicked to the final slide. A simple chart, clean, clinical, a DNA comparison, and the teacher stepped forward, smiling, explaining how the project matched genetic markers with potential relatives for educational purposes. Her tone light, unaware of the weight pressing into the room, and then she said it, clear and unfiltered. A 99.9% match with a submitted reference profile, and the name appeared on the screen in bold black letters, Ethan Caldwell. And the silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was recognition, a ripple moving through the crowd as whispers broke out, as heads turned, as phones lifted higher, capturing not just a project, but a moment that didn't belong to science anymore. Ethan felt it then, not the pressure of reputation, not the fear of headlines, but something deeper, something more personal, as if the life he had carefully constructed had just been opened in front of strangers. And he couldn't look away, because the boy on that stage wasn't just presenting data, he was standing as proof, living, breathing proof of a truth Ethan had never faced. And Noah paused, glancing toward the audience, his gaze landing on Ethan with a quiet curiosity that didn't yet understand the weight of what connected them. And for the first time in years, Ethan didn't have control over the narrative, didn't have the words ready, didn't have a strategy to lean on, because some truths don't wait for permission. They arrive, uninvited, undeniable, and rewrite everything in a single breath while Amara remained still in the shadows, her silence not empty but deliberate, the kind that holds years of choices, of walking away, of building a life without looking back. And as the room filled with murmurs and shifting tension, one thing became clear in a way no headline could soften. The legacy Ethan had spent his life protecting was no longer his to define. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured, slowly at first, then all at once as whispers spread across the auditorium like a current no one could stop. Parents leaning toward each other, phones rising higher, screens glowing as they captured the moment from every angle. But Ethan Caldwell did not move. He remained seated, shoulders squared, hands resting on his knees, as if stillness alone could hold the world together. Yet his eyes stayed locked on the stage where Noah stood, small but unshaken, unaware that the number behind him had just altered the weight of every breath in that room. And then the teacher cleared her throat, her voice softer now, uncertain. as if she realized too late that something private had just been made public. She tried to continue, explaining data points and methodology, but no one was listening anymore. Not really, because the truth had already landed, and it did not need further explanation. It simply existed, visible and undeniable. And across the aisle, Amara Brooks finally moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a single step forward, her posture straight, her expression calm in a way that did not ask for approval or permission. She did not look at the audience, did not acknowledge the phones or the whispers. She looked only at her son, and when Noah's eyes found hers, there was a quiet exchange, something grounding, something steady, as if she was reminding him without words that he was safe, that none of this changed who he was, and that calm stood in sharp contrast to the storm building around them. Ethan felt it then, not the noise, but the distance. The years that had placed him on one side of a line he had drawn himself, and for the first time he could not step across it with authority or certainty. He rose slowly from his seat, the movement subtle but enough to draw attention, a few heads turning, a few voices dropping to silence again as the man they all recognized finally stood. But he did not walk toward the stage immediately. He hesitated, just for a second, as if measuring the weight of what that step would mean, because once he moved, there would be no returning to the version of himself that had entered that room. And on stage, Noah shifted slightly, glancing back at the screen, then toward Ethan again, curiosity deepening into something quieter, more personal, and his voice came again, softer this time, directed not to the room but to the man who had not yet reached him, asking a simple question that carried more truth than any data point ever could. "Why do you have my face?" The words hung there, suspended between them, and Ethan felt something inside him tighten. Not panic, not fear, but recognition, the kind that strips away layers until only what matters remains. He took a step forward then, just one, the polished floor echoing faintly beneath his shoes, and the room seemed to hold its breath with him. But before he could speak, before he could offer any explanation or defense, Amara's voice entered the space. Low, controlled, not raised but impossible to ignore. "You do not get to answer him like this." The words were not loud, but they landed with clarity, drawing a boundary in a moment that could have easily spiraled into something else. Ethan stopped, his gaze shifting from Noah to Amara, and for the first time since the reveal his expression changed, not to anger or frustration, but to something quieter, something closer to understanding, because her words were not an attack. They were a line, one he had crossed years ago without looking back, and now he stood on the other side of it, unable to pretend it did not exist. The teacher stepped back, unsure, giving space without knowing what to do with it, and the audience remained still, caught between witnessing and intruding, while Amara walked toward the stage with measured steps, her heels soft against the floor, her presence steady. She reached Noah, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, grounding him again. And when she looked at Ethan this time, her eyes held no anger, no accusation, only truth, the kind that does not need to be repeated. "You made your choice," she said, her voice even, "years ago." And for a moment the entire room faded for Ethan, the cameras, the whispers, the weight of his name, all of it dimmed against the simplicity of that statement, because it was not about what had just been revealed, it was about what had already been decided long before this day. And as Noah stood between them, one hand resting lightly against his mother, the distance between past and present felt smaller than it ever had, and yet more impossible to ignore. No one clapped when she spoke, no one moved, because the weight of her words did not invite reaction, it demanded recognition. And Ethan felt it settle in his chest in a way no boardroom pressure ever had, not sharp, not immediate, but heavy and lasting, like something that would not leave once it arrived. And for a moment he did not try to respond, did not reach for the kind of control he was known for, because there was nothing to negotiate here, no strategy to apply, only a truth that had been waiting long before this room existed. And Noah looked between them again, his small face searching, not for answers that sounded right, but for something that felt real, something he could hold on to without confusion. And his fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the presentation board, as if grounding himself in the only thing that had made sense a moment ago. And Ethan saw that, saw the subtle shift in the boy's posture, The way uncertainty replaced confidence, and it moved. Something deeper than reputation ever could, because this was not about headlines or image anymore. It was about a child trying to understand a question no one had prepared him for. And Ethan took another step forward, slower this time. Careful, not toward the stage directly, but toward the space where distance could still be respected, and his voice when it came was quieter than anyone in that room expected, not commanding, not polished, just steady. "I am not here to confuse him," he said, his eyes still on Noah. And the simplicity of the sentence carried more weight than any explanation could have. Amara watched him without interruption, her expression unchanged. But there was something in her stillness that suggested she was listening, not for excuses, but for intention, and the difference between the two was something Ethan was only beginning to understand. The room shifted again, the tension no longer sharp but stretched, as if everyone present realized they were witnessing something that could not be reduced to a single moment, something that had roots deeper than what the screen had revealed. And Noah lowered the microphone slightly, his voice softer now, almost unsure, asking again, but this time differently, "Do you know me?" And the question landed with a kind of clarity that stripped everything else away, because it was no longer about resemblance or data, it was about presence, about whether the man standing there had ever been part of his world in any way that mattered. And Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not have words, but because the truth did not fit into the answers he was used to giving. And in that pause something shifted in him. Something that had nothing to do with image and everything to do with responsibility. "I did not know you," he said finally, each word deliberate. "But I see you now." And the honesty in it did not erase the past, did not fix anything that had already been done, but it existed without defense, without rewriting what had been. And Amara's gaze held his for a moment longer, measuring, not the statement itself, but the space it came from. And Noah listened, really listened, his expression softening. Just slightly, not into trust, not into acceptance, but into something quieter, a willingness to understand more than he had a minute ago. And the teacher, still standing off to the side, glanced toward the principal, unsure whether to continue or to end the presentation altogether, but neither stepped in, because the moment had already moved beyond the structure they had planned. And as the room remained suspended in that fragile balance, Ethan felt the shift fully, not as a collapse, but as a redirection, the kind that does not announce itself loudly but changes everything that follows. Because for the first time he was not thinking about how to control what people saw, he was thinking about what the boy standing a few feet away needed to hear. And that realization settled into him with a clarity he could not ignore, while Amara placed a gentle hand on Noah's shoulder again, grounding him once more, her voice low as she said his name, reminding him without pulling him away, giving him the choice to stay in the moment or step back from it. And Noah remained where he was, his small frame steady again, his eyes no longer searching the room, but focused on the man who had just admitted something simple and incomplete. And in that space between what had been revealed and what had yet to be understood, one truth stood clear in a way nothing else could replace. This was only the beginning of something that could no longer be undone. The air did not return to normal after his words. It shifted into something quieter, heavier, as if the room itself was learning how to hold what had just been said. And for a long second no one moved. Not the teachers, not the parents, not even the students waiting their turn, because the moment no longer belonged to a school event. It belonged to something far more personal, something unfolding in real time without a script. And Noah stood there, still holding the microphone loosely now, his eyes steady on Ethan, not with accusation, not with anger, but with the kind of focus that children carry when they are trying to understand something adults have complicated. And Amara felt it too, the shift in her son, the way he was not retreating, not shrinking, but standing in the center of a truth that had arrived without warning. And she did not pull him away, did not interrupt again, because she knew this moment was no longer hers to control. It was his, and Ethan recognized that as well, the difference between stepping forward for himself and stepping forward for the boy. And that distinction slowed him, forced him to choose each movement with care. He did not approach the stage, did not reach out. He stayed where he was, giving space not as distance but as respect, and his voice when it came again carried that restraint. "I do not expect you to understand everything today," he said, not loudly, not for the room, but for Noah, and the simplicity of it grounded the moment in a way nothing else could, because it acknowledged what this was: not a solution, not an answer, but the beginning of something neither of them had prepared for. And Noah lowered his gaze briefly, absorbing the words, then looked back up, his expression softer but still searching, and he asked, almost quietly, "Did you know my mom?" And the question moved through the space with a different kind of weight, one that reached beyond him, beyond Ethan, directly to Amara. And for the first time since stepping forward, she did not remain completely still. Her shoulders shifted just slightly, her breath slower, as if the past had stepped into the present without asking permission, and Ethan felt it too, not as a memory he could control, but as something that existed between them, unspoken but undeniable, and he answered carefully, not with explanation, not with justification, but with truth. "I knew her," he said, his eyes meeting Amara's for a brief second, before returning to Noah, "and I should have stayed." The admission did not rise in volume. It did not demand attention, but it carried something deeper than apology, something closer to acknowledgement, and the room reacted in a way that was almost invisible, a subtle stillness, a quiet understanding that this was not a performance, not a statement meant for reputation, but something that existed outside of all of that. And Amara watched him, her expression unreadable to anyone else, but within it there was a shift, not forgiveness, not acceptance, but recognition that he had chosen not to rewrite the past in that moment. And that mattered in a way nothing else could. And Noah listened, his small frame steady again, his grip on the microphone loosening further as the tension in his shoulders eased just enough for him to breathe normally. And he nodded once, not in agreement, not in resolution, but in understanding that the answer he had received was real, even if it was incomplete. And the teacher finally stepped forward again, her voice gentle, suggesting they continue the program, her tone careful, respectful of what had just taken place. And Noah glanced at his mother, then back at Ethan, and something passed between them, something quiet, something that did not need words, and he turned slightly, preparing to step away from the center of the stage. But before he did, he paused, just for a moment, and looked back one last time, not with confusion now, but with a kind of calm curiosity that left the door open rather than closed it. And Ethan remained where he was, not following, not calling out, understanding that this was not a moment to claim, but a moment to earn over time. And as Noah stepped down from the stage, Amara's hand resting lightly on his back, guiding but not pulling, the room slowly began to move again, conversations returning in low tones, phones lowering, the structure of the event attempting to rebuild itself around what had just happened. But for Ethan, nothing returned to what it had been before, because as he stood there, watching them walk toward the aisle, he understood something with a clarity he had never allowed before. This was not about fixing a moment. It was about facing every moment he had avoided. And that path would not be public, it would not be immediate, and it would not be easy, but it was the only one left to take. The program resumed. But it did not feel the same, voices returning in fragments, applause softer, distracted, as if everyone present was still holding on to what had just unfolded. And Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer before finally stepping back, not toward the stage but toward the exit aisle, his movements controlled yet slower than before, as though each step required a level of awareness he had never needed in rooms like this. And as he reached the side of the auditorium, he glanced once more toward where Noah and Amara had disappeared, not searching for them, not expecting anything, just acknowledging the direction they had gone. And then he stepped outside into the corridor where the air felt different, quieter, stripped of the weight of an audience, but not of the reality he now carried. And he stopped there, just past the doors, his reflection faint in the glass panel, a version of himself that no longer matched the one who had walked in. And for the first time in years, he did not reach for his phone, did not call an assistant, did not initiate damage control, because none of that applied here. None of it could touch what had just been revealed. And down the hall he noticed movement. Amara and Noah walking toward the exit, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder again, guiding him with the same steady presence she had shown on stage. And Ethan hesitated, not out of uncertainty of what he wanted, but out of understanding that wanting was not enough anymore. And yet he moved, not quickly, not with urgency, just enough to close some of the distance while still leaving space between them. And when he spoke, his voice carried without pressure, without demand. "Amara," he said, her name unfamiliar in his voice after so many years, and she paused, not immediately turning, but acknowledging that she had heard him, and Noah looked up at her before glancing back at Ethan. Curiosity still present, but quieter now, and slowly Amara turned, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, not guarded, not open, simply present, and Ethan stopped several feet away, respecting the line she had already drawn. "I am not here to disrupt your life," he said, choosing each word carefully. "I know I do not get to ask for anything." And the honesty in that statement did not come with expectation, it came with acceptance, and Amara studied him for a moment, not his words, but the way he held them, the absence of control behind them, and that was something she had not seen before, not when it mattered. And Noah shifted slightly beside her, looking between them again, absorbing more than either of them realized. And Ethan continued, quieter now, "I would like to understand who he is, not as a claim, but as a responsibility I did not take when I should have." And the words settled between them without forcing a response. And for a moment Amara said nothing, her silence not dismissive but deliberate, weighing not just what he said, but what it would mean if she allowed even a small opening, because she had built a life without him, a life defined by stability, by choices made in the absence of someone who had chosen to leave, and that foundation was not something she would risk lightly, not for him, not for anyone. And Noah looked up at her again, his voice softer this time, almost thoughtful, asking a question that was not about answers anymore, but about possibility. "Are we going home?" And Amara's gaze softened just slightly as she looked down at him, grounding herself in what mattered most. "Yes," she said gently, and then she looked back at Ethan, her voice steady. "You do not get to step into his life because today happened," the boundary clear, unshaken. But she did not turn away immediately, not this time. There was a pause, a fraction longer than before, and in that pause something shifted, not permission, not forgiveness, but a recognition that the door was not completely sealed, just carefully controlled. "If you want to understand him," she continued, "you start by understanding what you walked away from, not from me, from him," and the distinction landed with clarity. And Ethan nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, because for the first time he understood that this was not about proving anything. It was about learning something he had never taken the time to see. And Amara turned then, guiding Noah toward the exit, her hand steady on his shoulder, and they walked away without looking back, not out of rejection, but out of certainty. And Ethan remained in the corridor, watching them until they disappeared through the doors. And even after they were gone, he did not move immediately, because the path in front of him was no longer defined by what he could control, but by what he was willing to face, step by step, without expecting anything in return. The hallway felt longer after they left, not because the distance had changed, but because time had slowed in a way Ethan was not used to, each second stretching just enough for him to feel the weight of what had been said, and what had not. And for the first time in years he did not rush to fill that space. He let it exist, standing there until the faint sound of the exit doors closing echoed back through the corridor, marking the moment as complete. And only then did he move, not toward his car, not toward the waiting world that usually demanded his attention, but back toward the quiet side of the building where the noise could not reach him, because there was something he needed to face before anything else, something he had avoided for far too long. And as he walked, the image of Noah on that stage did not leave him, not the DNA result, not the whispers, but the question, "Do you know me?" It repeated in his mind with a clarity that stripped away every other thought, because it was not a question that could be answered once. It was a question that demanded time, presence, and truth. And Ethan knew, in a way he could not ignore, that he had none of those things to offer yet, not in the way that mattered. And that realization settled into him as something final, not a burden, but a starting point. And later that evening, long after the event had ended and the building had emptied, Ethan sat alone in his office, the city lights stretching beyond the glass walls, silent and distant, his reflection faint against the skyline. And for once he did not turn away from it, because the man looking back at him was no longer defined by control or precision, but by something he had never fully acknowledged, absence. And it was not just the absence of a relationship. It was the absence of presence in a life that had existed without him, a life that had grown, adapted, and found its own stability without his name attached to it. And on his desk lay a simple folder, one he had asked his assistant to compile without explanation, not a corporate file, not a strategic report, but a collection of what little could be found about Amara Brooks and her son, public records, school achievements, small details that most people would overlook. And Ethan opened it slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what it represented. And as he read, the information did not overwhelm him. It grounded him, each detail forming a picture not of what he had missed in a single moment, but of what he had chosen not to be part of over years: school, awards, science fair participation, a teacher's note describing Noah as thoughtful and observant, a child who listened more than he spoke. And Ethan paused at that line, because it mirrored something he had seen himself, that quiet awareness, that way of holding back until understanding came. And it struck him then, not as coincidence, but as connection, one that existed whether he had acknowledged it or not. And he leaned back in his chair, the file still open in his hands, the silence of the room no longer empty but filled with a kind of clarity he had not allowed before. And for the first time he did not think about how to approach Amara again, did not plan what to say or how to present himself, because he understood now that none of that would matter if it was not backed by something real, something consistent, something that could not be questioned, and that could not be created in a single conversation. It had to be built, slowly, without expectation, without guarantee, and across the city, in a small, quiet home that did not carry his name. Amara sat at the edge of Noah's bed, the soft glow of a bedside lamp casting warm light across the room, her hand resting gently on his as he lay back, still awake, still thinking, and his voice came softly, not uncertain, just curious. He did not look angry, he said, and Amara listened, her expression calm, her voice steady when she answered. People are not only what they look like in one moment. And Noah considered that, his gaze drifting to the ceiling as he processed the thought. And after a pause he asked, "Will I see him again?" And Amara did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because the answer was not hers alone to give anymore. It depended on something that had not yet been proven, something that would take time. And finally she said, "That depends on what he chooses to do next." And the words settled into the quiet of the room, simple but true. And as Noah's eyes slowly closed, his breathing evening out into sleep, Amara remained there a moment longer, her hands still resting lightly against his, her thoughts not on the past, not on what had been revealed, but on what would come. Because for the first time in years, the future was no longer entirely within her control, and that did not weaken her. It simply reminded her that some truths, once uncovered, do not ask permission before they begin to change everything. The next morning did not arrive with clarity. It arrived with quiet, the kind that settles before decisions are made. And Ethan stood at the window of his office long before the city fully woke, watching the first light stretch across glass towers and empty streets, his reflection steady now, not searching for answers but acknowledging what had changed. Because for the first time his day was not driven by meetings or numbers. It was shaped by a question he could not ignore, what he would do next. And when his assistant entered with the usual schedule, Ethan did not turn immediately, did not reach for the tablet or the list of obligations. Instead, he said something simple, clear: "Cancel everything that is not essential." And the words landed with a weight that shifted the room, because it was not something he had said before, not in a way that meant it. And once the door closed again, he picked up the folder from the night before, not to read it again, but to carry it with him, as if it grounded the decision he was about to make. And later that afternoon, the school parking lot was quieter than it had been the day before, the crowd gone, the noise replaced by the ordinary rhythm of dismissal, children stepping out with backpacks, parents waiting by their cars, conversations light and familiar. And Ethan stood at a distance near the edge of the lot, not hidden, not announced, simply present, his posture still, his hands at his sides. And he did not approach immediately, because this was not a moment to interrupt. It was a moment to observe, to understand what he had not been part of. And when Noah finally appeared, walking beside Amara with that same steady pace, something shifted again, not in the environment, but in Ethan. because seeing them outside of that charged moment, outside of the spotlight, made everything more real, more grounded, and he took a step forward then, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to be seen. Without forcing attention, and Amara noticed him first, her gaze lifting from Noah to Ethan, her expression unchanged but aware, and she slowed slightly, giving Noah the chance to notice as well. And when he did, there was no shock this time, no confusion, only recognition, and something quieter beneath it, something that suggested he had been thinking about this since the day before. And Ethan stopped where he was, respecting the space again. And he spoke without raising his voice. I said I would start by understanding. And I meant it. The statement simple, but different now, because it was followed by action, by presence without pressure, and Amara watched him carefully, not searching for flaws, but for consistency, for something that would either confirm or challenge what he had shown so far. And Noah shifted his backpack slightly on his shoulder, his eyes moving between them before settling on Ethan again. And this time, he stepped forward first, just a small step, but enough to change the dynamic of the moment. And he asked, not as a test, but as a continuation, "Are you going to come again?" And the question held no demand, only curiosity shaped by experience, and Ethan did not answer. Immediately, not because he hesitated, but because he understood the importance of what he said next. "I will come if it is okay with your mom," he said, his gaze moving briefly to Amara before returning to Noah, and the response shifted something subtle in the air, because it placed the decision where it belonged, not with him, not with the moment, but with the person who had carried the responsibility all along. And Amara felt that, the difference between showing up and imposing, and she remained silent for a moment, considering not just his words, but the pattern they were beginning to form. And Noah looked up at her again, not asking, not insisting, just waiting, and she exhaled slowly, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "You can come, but you do not change anything yet." The boundary clear, the permission measured, and Ethan nodded once, not as victory, but as acknowledgement of the terms. Because this was not about gaining ground. It was about earning trust one moment at a time. And as Noah adjusted his backpack again, a small smile almost forming before he turned back toward the car, the shift in him was quiet but present, and Ethan remained where he was, not following, not extending the moment beyond what it was meant to be, because he understood now that progress did not come from pushing forward. It came from showing up again and again, without expectation. And as Amara opened the car door and guided Noah inside, she glanced back once, not with uncertainty, but with a recognition that something had begun, something she would control, something he would have to prove. And for Ethan, standing alone in that parking lot as the car pulled away, there was no sense of completion, only a clear understanding of what came next. Not a grand gesture, not a single conversation, but the steady work of becoming someone who could answer a child's question with more than words. Days did not pass loudly after that afternoon. They settled into a rhythm that was almost invisible to anyone outside of it. But for Ethan, each day carried a quiet decision, to show up or to return to the life he had before. And he chose the same answer every time, not with declarations, not with announcements, but with presence, consistent and measured. And by the end of the week, the school parking lot no longer felt unfamiliar. It became a place where he stood without expectation, watching the ordinary moments unfold, children laughing, parents calling out names, the routine of a life that had never needed him, and yet now allowed him to stand at its edge. And Noah noticed first, not with surprise anymore, but with recognition that grew into something steadier, something that did not need to be questioned each time. And he began to slow his steps slightly when he saw Ethan, not stopping, not rushing forward, just adjusting the moment in a way that made space for something new to exist. And Amara saw that shift as well, the subtle change in her son, the way curiosity was no longer mixed with confusion, but with a kind of quiet interest. And she did not interrupt it, did not rush to define it, because she understood that forcing clarity too soon would only weaken what needed time to form. And Ethan remained consistent, never stepping too close, never extending the moment beyond what was given, sometimes speaking briefly, sometimes simply nodding, allowing Noah to decide how much of the interaction he wanted to carry. And over time the conversations grew, small at first, questions about school, about subjects he liked, about the science project that had started everything. And Noah answered in his own way, thoughtful, precise, not eager to impress, but willing to share when he felt safe enough to do so. And Ethan listened, not interrupting, not redirecting, just taking in each detail as if it mattered more than any meeting he had ever attended, because it did. And one afternoon, as the sun sat lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Noah lingered a little longer before heading to the car, his backpack resting against his shoulder, his voice calm when he spoke. I have another project next month, and Ethan nodded slightly, waiting, not assuming, and Noah continued. It is about building something, not just explaining it. And there was a pause, not awkward, not forced, just space for the thought to settle. And then he added, you can see it if you want. The invitation simple, unpolished, but significant in a way that neither of them needed to explain, and Ethan felt the weight of that moment immediately, not as pressure, but as trust beginning to take shape, and he answered without hesitation but with care, I would like that. And the words did not carry excitement. They carried commitment, the kind that would be tested over time, and Amara stood by the car, watching, not intervening, her posture steady, her presence grounding. The moment as it always had been. And when Noah turned toward her, she opened the door without speaking, allowing the interaction to end naturally, without stretching it beyond what it was meant to be. And as Noah got into the car, he glanced back once more, not searching, not uncertain, just acknowledging, and Ethan returned the look with the same quiet steadiness, not reaching for more, not holding onto the moment, just letting it exist. And as the car pulled away again, something remained. Not a resolution, not a guarantee, but a shift that could not be undone, because for the first time the connection between them was not defined by revelation or shock. It was defined by choice, repeated, consistent, and real. And later that evening, as Ethan sat alone once more, the city lights no longer distant but familiar again, he did not reach for the folder this time. He did not need to, because the information he had read was no longer abstract. It had a voice now, a presence, a future, that was slowly allowing him to be part of it. And he understood something clearly, something that did not need to be spoken out loud. Legacy was not what he had built before, it was what he was choosing to build now, one moment at a time, without certainty, without control, but with intention that could no longer be denied. The day of the next project arrived without announcement. No tension in the air, no crowd leaning forward in anticipation, just a normal school morning where students carried their work into the classroom with quiet focus. And Ethan stood once again at the edge of that world, not as a guest this time, not as a name on a program, but as someone who had been allowed to return. And he did not step inside immediately. He waited until he saw Noah through the glass doors, standing beside a table, adjusting small pieces of a structure he had built with careful hands. And there was something different in the way Ethan watched him now, not searching for resemblance, not measuring connection, just seeing him as he was, a boy focused on something he cared about. And when Noah looked up and noticed him, there was no pause this time, no uncertainty, just a small nod that acknowledged his presence as something expected, something that belonged to the moment rather than interrupted it. And Ethan returned that nod, stepping inside quietly, taking a place near the back where he could see without drawing attention. And the room filled gradually with parents and teachers, voices low, movement steady, the kind of ordinary environment that did not need to impress anyone. And when Noah's turn came, he did not rush. He did not hesitate. He explained what he had built, with the same calm clarity he had shown before. But there was something else now, something more grounded, as if he was no longer carrying an unspoken question while he spoke. And Ethan listened, fully present, not checking his watch, not dividing his attention, just listening. And when the presentation ended, there was applause, simple and genuine, and Noah stepped back from the table, his eyes moving through the room until they found Ethan. And for a second, everything else faded again, not because of shock, but because of recognition that had grown into something steady. And when the room began to shift, people moving from table to table, conversations starting up again, Noah walked toward him, not quickly, not hesitantly, just directly. And he stopped a few feet away, the same space that had always been there, but it felt different now, less like distance, more like respect. And Ethan spoke first, his voice quiet but certain. You built something real, and Noah nodded slightly, his gaze thoughtful as he answered. It works because every part has to connect the right way, and the words carried more than their surface meaning. And Ethan understood that without needing it explained, and there was a pause, not empty, not uncomfortable, just space where something could settle. And then Noah asked, not looking away, "Are you going to stay?" And the question did not carry doubt anymore. It carried expectation shaped by what had already been shown, and Ethan did not hesitate this time, not because the answer was easy, but because it had already been decided long before this moment. "Yes," he said, not as a promise made in the moment, but as a continuation of what he had already begun. And Noah nodded again, a small movement, but enough. And then he turned slightly, glancing toward his mother who stood a few steps away, watching as she always had, her presence steady, her expression unchanged to anyone else. But within it there was a shift, not relief, not resolution, but recognition that something had held, something had not broken under the weight of time and truth. And when Noah looked back at Ethan one more time, his voice came softer, but clearer than anything before. "Okay." And then after a brief pause, almost as if the word had been waiting until the moment felt right, he added, "Dad." And the sound of it did not echo. It did not stop the room. It existed quietly between them, but it carried more weight than anything that had come before. And Ethan did not move immediately, not out of shock, but because he understood what that word meant, not a title given freely, not a role claimed, but something that had been earned in the smallest, most consistent ways. And he nodded once, not reaching for more, not trying to define it further, just accepting it as it was. And in that moment, the legacy he had once believed was built in boardrooms and contracts no longer held the same meaning, because standing there, in a simple classroom filled with ordinary light and quiet voices, he understood that legacy was not something written once and protected forever. It was something rewritten, moment by moment, by the choices a person was willing to stand behind, even when no one was watching. And as Noah turned back toward his project, continuing to explain it to another student, and Amara remained nearby, her posture steady, her presence unchanged, Ethan stayed where he was, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because for the first time, he was exactly where he needed to be.